Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Rian Johnson's 2019 film Knives Out, which I really like. I think it's a great movie. It is a murder mystery movie, but the mystery is not who committed the murder. The mystery is who drives the investigation, who is engineering everything. Because basically what happens is you have a wealthy WASP New England mystery writer named Harlan. He kills himself at the beginning of the film. This is what we know. And as part of the investigation, a guy named Benoit Blanc shows up. What we learn about Benoit Blanc initially is that he's been written about in the New York Times, a point which comes up with a couple of characters, and that the Times referred to him as, I think it's the last of the gentleman sleuths. So Benoit Blanc is there investigating. But it's not initially clear what, because the assumption is that it was a suicide. Blanc sort of pushes back on this narrative, and we start increasingly following the character Marta Cabrera, who was Harlan's nurse. We then learn what actually happened, which is that Marta accidentally gave Harlan an overdose of morphine rather than the other drug that she was supposed to give him. And because they were so far out from the nearest hospital or anything, there wasn't time to send for an ambulance. And so Harlan killed himself to make it look like a suicide so that Marta would not be held responsible. Then he concocted, prior to killing himself, he concocted with Marta a scheme in which they would basically cover up her error. This is essentially what Blanc is investigating, is trying to figure out what actually happened. Things take a pretty significant turn when Harlan's will is read, and he has cut all of his family out of his will, leaving everything to Marta. Now, his family are, generally speaking, entitled dicks for the most part. And this is really important, and I'm going to talk more about this. So, there's a series of investigative lines of inquiry in which Blanc, interestingly enough, sort of chooses Marta to be his Watson. He chooses her to be his sort of assistant as he's investigating this case. In part, he chooses her, as far as we can tell, because she can't lie. She has a physiological reaction to lying in which she throws up. And so he believes that he can trust her. He also identifies her as just a good person, whereas everybody else in the family is basically selfish dicks. So there's investigative stuff, etc., etc. Marta tries to cover her tracks in various ways, etc., etc. The family gets really, really pissed off that she is inheriting and they are not, so they try and come after her, etc., etc. And eventually, Blanc comes to the question that really interests him, which is not so much who killed Harlan, because he did kill himself, but who hired Blanc. Because he got, in his mail, a newspaper clipping about Harlan's death and a folder of money. And he makes that gesture, an envelope of money. So Blanc is really interested in who hired him to investigate something that's pretty clearly a suicide. And eventually what comes out is that Harlan's unemployed, narcissistic playboy grandson, Hugh, switched the labels on the bottles of medicine. So actually, Marta didn't give Harlan an overdose of morphine. She gave him the right drug in the right amount because she grabbed the bottle that she knew to be the right drug, the actual drug for his disease. And LeBlanc basically proves that by covering the labels, and she picks the right bottle. So, the reason that Hugh had done this was because he found out that, or he was told by Harlan that the family was going to be cut out of the will, everything was going to be left to Marta, and so what Hugh figured is, if I can get Marta convicted of murdering my grandfather, then she will lose the inheritance, and it will go back to the family, and I will get my share. So that was the whole plan. Now, what do I find really interesting about the movie? I think what's fascinating is the commentary on the wealthy. And of course, for 29, I mean, this is a very topical movie. There are a lot of contemporary references. There are references to the musical Hamilton. There's references to Trump's presidency. There's references to contemporary, like, alt-right online debates and things like that. And of course, the theme of wealth and privilege and power was incredibly important in 2019, as it still is in 2021. But I think the movie, and in a way, the movie's sort of, I think, official narrative is very straightforward. Harlan's family members are wealthy, privileged dicks who are completely unaware of their own wealth and privilege. I mean, several of Harlan's kids or their spouses are like, I've built my business. But they all built their business with very, very large loans from Harlan. So the kids are not like, this is the thing. This is the thing with most rich people that we sort of know of with this pulled themselves up by their bootstraps story. So people like Bezos, people like Gates, people like Musk. This idea that, like, they built their companies and they built themselves up from nothing. No, they didn't. If you actually look into their backgrounds, they built themselves up from the lower echelons of the rich, the lower echelons of the upper class, or at worst, the absolute top level of the upper middle class. Like, these are people who were in positions to get $1 million loans from their parents. They got connections. They got access to education, access to resources. These are not people who were like, I've grown up in a shotgun shack in Alabama or a single room apartment in Detroit. No, these are people who were already wealthy and privileged, but who have built on that wealth and privilege, which is not the same thing as being self-made. It's being self-improved. And that's what Harlan's kids and grandkids are. They have access to money, they have access to wealthy and influential people, they have access to resources to build their businesses, etc., etc. And they're not aware of that. And they're the villains of the piece, really. I mean, they're, socially speaking, they are the villains, even though only Hugh was involved in murdering Harlan. So he's the only sort of villain as such in terms of the direct plot. In terms of the socio-cultural commentary the film wants us to take away, the disgusting self-absorption of the parasitic rich is one of the key ideas. And interestingly enough, we have this played out in several different ways, one of the most striking of which being an indictment of the idea of trickle-down economics. Because in one scene, after Marta has gotten the inheritance and she's sort of fled back to her own house to avoid basically being lynched by these dispossessed rich people, the one brother comes to her apartment because they have found out from the one sort of decent-seeming member of this family who was actually friends with Marta. They found out that Marta's mother is an undocumented immigrant. And so this guy, this brother, whose name I can't remember off the top of my head, comes to her home and is basically like, look, if you give us back all of the money, we will have the resources to help fix this problem, to help make sure your mother's is allowed to legally stay in the country, because we have the resources to do that. And what Marta says is very clever, but very straightforward. She says, well, if you would have the resources to do that, Harlan gave me all of your resources, which means I can fix this problem. I don't require you. She doesn't say she doesn't require them, but that's the message there. And this is a critique of trickle-down economics, because the same fundamental logic is there. If we give the rich all of the money, then we will somehow get that money back. It is the absurd idea that if we take all of the money that we could otherwise have and give it to someone else, then we will somehow have it. And this moment in which Marta's like, I have all the resources. I don't need to give you all of the resources so you can use a tiny fraction of it to possibly help me. This is a direct critique of trickle-down economics. And I think it's brilliantly done. But I had said before that this is the film's sort of intended socio-economic or socio-cultural message. And I think it's actually much more complicated than the film wants to acknowledge. Because, in a way, the film makes a distinction between the undeserving rich, the parasitical rich who draw on Harlan's resources and don't really build things for themselves, or who are so deeply imbued with their sense of privilege that they can't even see themselves as privileged. And on the other hand, we have this notion of the deserving rich, namely Harlan and Marta. So the film wants us to see both Harlan and Marta as positive figures. Harlan because, as far as we know, he's worked hard, he's written a ton of books, they've done spectacularly well, and he's made a massive amount of money from book sales. And he's done this without the sort of cheap approach of selling rights, which is an interesting thing for a movie to say, that, like, books are better than movies and you shouldn't sell the rights to your books. But that's a separate question. Because the son who runs Harlan's publishing company wants to sell adaptation rights, and I think he actually at one point talks about a deal with Netflix people. So we've got that element, and Harlan is resistant. He wants the book to have its own sort of special magical aura, its own independent existence, apart from a movie or a TV adaptation. So Harlan is supposed to represent this sort of wealthy person with integrity. He also has an ethical stance in that he wants to force his family to take responsibility for themselves and he blames himself for letting them become lazy and dependent parasites. Now, Harlan is interesting because we don't actually know much about his backstory. We know that he's a murder mystery author and he's very, very wealthy, but we don't know much else. And so given the fact that so many of his children and their spouses and his grandchildren have that narrative of, I built my business, I am self-made, when we know in fact that they're not, it raises the question of whether or not we can trust that Harlan is self-made. I mean, do we know that he did not inherit a bunch of money and just built on it? Do we know that he didn't come from a privileged background? Not really. So we've got that interesting element where it's a sort of blank background that allows us to assume that Harlan is genuinely self-made, even though statistically that's incredibly unlikely. The second deserving wealthy person is Marta, who gets rich because Harlan has left her everything. She works hard as his nurse. She's very good at it. She doesn't make her money from doing that. But there is a sense, like Benoit Blanc basically says, I chose you to help me investigate because you're a good person. So there's this sense that she is rewarded for her goodness, which is an incredibly interesting point in a film that one of its major theses is that the rich are kind of shitty parasites. So this idea, this is the capitalist fantasy, right? That the rich are good people who deserve to be rich because they're good. And while that fantasy is undercut by Harlan's kids and grandkids and the spouses, it's reinforced at the end when Marta gets the money. She gets the money because she is good, not because she has actually done anything that specifically earned that monetary value. So, in this sense, the movie undercuts one of its own central ideas. The other thing, of course, is that the movie never asks what Marta is going to do with the money. Presumably, she's going to resolve the issues with her mother's immigration documents. So I take that back. There's one element in which the movie asks what she's going to do, because she asks Blanc whether or not she should help the Harlan's now dispossessed family. And Blanc says something to the effect of, I have my opinion, but I think you'll do the right thing. Which again, the premise of Marta as a character is that she's a good person. She's a good human being. And I accept that. I have no problem with that. So we find that out. But that's a really interesting contradiction or challenge as well, because throughout much of the film, the family has been like, oh, Marta, you're like part of the family. We're going to take such good care of you. But they've also treated her like a servant, which she isn't, technically. She was Harlan's nurse. She's not a servant. So you have that sort of interesting reversal where Marta now has the money, and her attitude is, I will benevolently help you all out. I will out of my fortune, give to the less fortunate. Now, there's a very good counter-argument to that, which is there is some legitimate sense in which Harlan's family has been dispossessed from what they could reasonably have thought would be theirs, and so it's not a bad thing necessarily to help them. But beyond that, we don't learn what Marta's going to do with the money. it's simply not it's not like the film is nefariously covering this up. It's simply not a question the film is interested in. Is Marta going to become, maybe against her better instincts, just another parasitic rich person who's going to sit in her big house with her money and not have to work, not have to do anything productive? We simply don't know. The film ends with her simply being rich, drinking out of Harlan's coffee mug that says, "My house, my rules, my coffee." Like, that's where we end, is her simply being rich. And the film wants us to take from that, or at least the way that I read the film, I don't think there's any real ambiguity about this. The film wants us to read her newfound wealth as a good thing. But given the problems with wealth that we've seen from Harlan's family, I don't think it's as clear as that.